Not everyone has huge amounts of money to blow on their shiny new system or GPU, and while we'd all love to have an RTX 4090 inside our build, we sometimes have to be a bit more humble and look at the modest sub $200 market, which is where Intel firmly believe they have some strong contenders, including what we're looking at today, the A580. Priced at just $180, how does it stack up against the likes of AMD and Nvidia? Well, that's what we're going to find out. But before we do, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits. Or, if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver. Thanks. But where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one.
So the A580, name sound familiar? I mean, it should, because you may remember that name from quite some time ago when Intel first showed the roadmap, and consumers were left thinking that Team Blue had, well, completely ditched the A580 from the lineup, until it suddenly started appearing in kind of last week at certain retail stores. So what does the A580 actually bring to the table? Well, firstly, you'll be surprised as to what models of A580 you'll actually be able to buy. Now, from our own kind of understanding, unlike the Intel branded and Acer models that you've seen in the past, the A580 will actually only be available in ASRock and Sparkle branded versions. And, well, that's it. In terms of specs, both the ASRock Challenger OC and Sparkle ARC come in identically with 24 Z-cores, 24 ray tracing units, a clock speed of 1700 MHz, 8GB of GDDR6, and a somewhat modest TDP of 185 watts. Now, while there isn't much context for these figures, there's also not much use comparing them to what AMD and Nvidia have, because it doesn't really show much. Though with 8GB of memory on a 256-bit memory bus, Intel are already off to a good start when compared to the likes of the RX 7600, RTX 4060 and 4060 Ti, all with their, let's say, inferior 128-bit memory bus. Now, when we get sent launch day cards like this one, with it we get given a driver and some handy reviewer guide material. It gives us the specs, the general rundown on the architecture, and how it compares in their own testing against other cards on the market. And with this, Intel pitted the new A580 against the RTX 3050 from Nvidia and RX 6600 from AMD. So that's what we're going to be putting our focus on today, while also including a few other cards to see kind of where it's positioned. Now, what makes this most interesting is that the RX 6600 at $209, the RTX 3050 at $229, and even the RX 7600, which is AMD's lowest end current gen part, at $239, means that all of the competition come in more expensive than the newest A580 from Intel. So maybe they're trying to be quite aggressive with their positioning. Who knows? So before we actually get into the benchmarks, I want to talk about the card itself. It's called the Sparkle ARC A580 ARC OC edition. And though we can't see that there is a non-OC version and no, let's say, MSRP card as such, it may actually confuse gamers a little bit. In typical Sparkle Intel fashion, the card is blue with a blue PCB, very much like we saw in the other Sparkle cards we looked at not too long ago. It sports a dual fan cooler and is quite simplistic in its design. Coming in at 223mm long, 99mm high and 44mm thick means it will only take up 2 slots inside your case. And with a weight of just 838 grams, it's pretty typical for what you'd expect a 1080p focused GPU to be, with I guess the only, let's say, standout feature being the Sparkle logo, which by default lights up a kind of greeny yellow, but this does actually dictate the colour based on what's actually going on in terms of the temperature of the card. Now, the card features a full backplate, which is nice to see on a card at this price, and for power, it has 2 8-pin power connectors, so no 12V PWR here. Also, in terms of display outputs, there's 3 DisplayPort connectors and a single HDMI, which should be more than enough for anyone wanting to utilise multi-monitor setups. So, Let's see how it performs, shall we? To test, we used our typical GPU test system consisting of an Intel Core i9-12900K and 32GB of Patriot Viper Venom 6200MHz DDR5 memory on an Asus ROG Maximus Hero Z690 motherboard. For our testing, we use Windows 11 and the 31.0.101.4830 driver from Intel, and due to the price and positioning of this card, we're going to be focusing solely on 1080p today. So, that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So kicking things off with a Plague Tale Requiem on the Ultra preset, and already the A580 is matching the performance of the RX 6600 and pushing 26% ahead of the RTX 3050. While the frame rates were below 60 FPS, this is on Ultra, and Intel are actually branding this more of a 1080p high base card, so I'm pretty happy with that overall. Moving on to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and again the A580 comes in ahead of the RTX 3050 with 8% more performance overall, though the RX 6600 does seem to get favoured quite heavily in this title, though at 67 frames per second is still nothing to grumble at when paying just $180. Cyberpunk again shows strong performance with a small 3% lead, which, while it doesn't sound like much, it's much better than it first seems, as the A580 comes in 14% cheaper to buy, which further cements its lead and puts it just behind the RTX 3060, though the ray tracing performance will of course be a lot better on the Nvidia based card. In Death Stranding, we see again a victory coming to Team Blue over the RX 3050 by a pretty staggering 19%, and for a cheaper price. Though again, the RX 6600 is the better choice in this game, with its very own 18% lead over the A580. Dying Light 2 sees the A580 pushing towards the top of our results, pushing ahead of both the RX 3050 by a huge margin of 57% and a lesser but still impressive 7% on the 6600. Again, with the fact that the A580 is the cheaper of the three cards, it puts it in a much better light when talking about value for money. Without sounding like a broken record, the Intel GPU again shows some impressive numbers in Hogwarts Legacy on the Ultra preset at 64 FPS, which puts it 31% ahead of Nvidia's RTX 3050, though it does put it behind the RX 6600 by 9%. And yes, we did retest both the RX 6600 and 6600 XT and saw margin of error differences in the performance on both cards, which seem to almost be throttled in this game. Horizon Zero Dawn on the ultimate quality settings sees some very playable frame rates, which pushes ahead of Nvidia's RTX 3050 by 11%, though the more expensive RX 6600 sits ahead of Intel by the same 11%, though this game has been known to favour AMD GPUs anyway. Spider-Man actually surprised me with some very strong numbers across the board on the very high preset, with Intel coming in the middle of our stack at 106 FPS. This also further cements its lead over the RX 6600 and RTX 3050. Two cards that will cost $30 to $50 more to buy brand new. Flight Sim is known to bring any GPU to its knees, but the A580 holds up pretty well at 45 FPS. While it is playable, you'd probably want to dial the settings down somewhat to increase that performance, though even on Ultra it still manages to dominate both AMD and Nvidia at their respective price points. Then finally in Watch Dogs Legion, the A580 manages to show why the Nvidia RTX 3050 was such a flop, as it pushes ahead by 13% in the averages, though it does lose out slightly to the RX 6600, though again, the disparity in cost there could go in Intel's favour. So some pretty interesting results, especially when you look at where the card is aimed at, which is 1080p high settings, and for the most part with our results we use Ultra. Now before anyone rushes to the comments, we only received our sample yesterday due to delays, so didn't really have time to retest this card on high settings as well as doing retests on some of the other cards, which is still actually fairly fresh results anyway, though we are looking to do a big retest with a new system soon, so definitely make sure you're subscribed for that. Now performance is one thing, but looking at the overall averages and cost per frame is probably the easiest way to gauge where each card is positioned, and to see how the Intel A580 really gets thrown into the mix. It's here where the A580 comes out the best value GPU you can buy right now, at $3.26 per frame when looking at the new retail market. Now, it is hard to ignore the likes of the GTX 1060 used at $2.24 per frame, and even the RX 7600 at $3.30 per frame, which, while it didn't receive the best and warmest welcome when it launched, the small price cut since its launch has definitely helped to put it in a, let's say, better light, though that memory interface is still a real stickler to some. Now another area to look at is the overall performance of the card itself in terms of power, temperatures and noise, because this can actually give an idea as to how a particular card is going to perform over a prolonged gaming session. When looking at the cooling performance during an hour-long loop of F123, and we saw a pretty stable affair with only minor fluctuations throughout the test. The GPU temperature quickly rose to 68 degrees upon starting our lap, but simply stayed there throughout the entire test, staying perfectly comfortable at that relatively low level. Memory did sit a bit higher at around 76 degrees on average, but it did see occasional dips down to 74. Now, with these temperatures being more than enough for the cooler to handle, we saw the core clock of the GPU reach a boost of up to 2400 MHz, with an average of around 2200. During this loop, the card's fans rose to around 2200 RPM, which sounds like a lot, but the tone of the fans meant that it was actually pretty quiet overall. In terms of power, the A580 was very low powered, sipping just 149 watts of power on average throughout the whole test. So again, overall it seems like Intel have ticked all of the right boxes, and while I always find it a tough one to talk about the lower end cards, I'm well aware that not everyone has the huge amounts of dollars to fork out on a high-end ray trace upscaled monster, and it's cards like this that kind of actually bring me down a peg or two back to reality. Now, what's clear to see is that the A580 is a perfectly fine card. You could argue it's a bit meh in the grand scheme of things, as it's taken on two cards from yesteryear, and the likes of the RX 7600, albeit more expensive, does come in 32% faster in the overall averages. And with AMD now sporting FSR3, it further gives them a push in performance that Intel was still maybe lacking behind with. Now, I did say it before, and I think it is actually worth saying again, but I still think Intel are lacking somewhat. But I think that was also expected, and I made it clear that I thought Intel's first generation of GPUs would actually fall behind the mark somewhat, and that's clear to see that they actually do, but they are getting better. But I think the key kind of takeaway for the boys in blue is that they are learning from every single thing that they do and every GPU launch, and maybe the next generation of Intel GPUs will be a huge leap forward. Though, when that is anyone's guess right now. Though for now, it's nice to have a little bit more competition in the market, especially in the low end, which I guess is an area that I guess us as reviewers tend to neglect a little bit. Though I am thankful for it, because benchmarking at a single resolution is a godsend compared to some of the other more complex tests that we have to do across multiple settings, resolutions and configurations. For now, I guess if you're in the market for a sub $200 GPU, there really is no other choice when looking at the new market and wanting the very best bang for buck. Though I will admit, the RX 7600 with the inclusion of FSR3 is a very hard one now to ignore, and the latest upscaling tech from AMD may just be the one redeeming quality that GPU now has after the memory bus issue it faced at launch. So yeah, for now, that about does it for this one. Let me know in the comments section below what you think about this GPU and what you think about Intel GPUs in general, because it does look like they're heading in the right direction and are picking up steam. And also picking up partner brands that, I don't know, had gone a little bit quiet for quite a few years. So it's nice to see Sparkle back in the game too. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you appreciate the huge amounts of work that we put into these videos, then consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to a whole host of goodies, including exclusive behind the scenes content, special Patreon game nights, access to our testing data, and much, much more. The link for all that great stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.